Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
iLAuNCH is a collaboration led by the University of Southern Queensland, along with the Australian National University and the University of South Australia. Their mission is to address critical gaps and accelerate the development of a space launch manufacturing sector in Australia. And my guest is Dr. Joni Sytsma, Chief Technology Officer of iLAuNCH. Joni, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
It's my pleasure. Very happy to do it. Let's talk first of all just about how iLAuNCH came into existence and what inspired its formation.
So about 2 years ago, the Department of Education dreamed up this Trailblazer program, and it was supposed to be a departure from the previous funding arrangements called cooperative research corporations. The idea was to fix some of the deficiencies that industry expressed about the CRCs, and in the era of continuous improvement, come up with a new kind of grant program that was short, sharp, and focused. So instead of long 7 to 10 year research projects, they wanted to make them 4 years and really try and align more closely with the needs of industry. And iLAuNCH is the space trailblazer.
So now iLAuNCH mentions 3 areas of interest. Their core commercialization projects, a space accelerator, and future skills development. So tell me a little bit more about each of those.
So our core 3 pillars are really focused about upskilling the future workforce of Australia, particularly in space. And let's start with future skills development. So we're developing a space engineering degree across our 3 universities, and that space engineering degree is aimed to start accepting enrollments next year. And it's going to focus on space engineering topics. So system engineering is a big deal, clearly, as well as space specific topics like orbital dynamics, space qualification, and business aspects behind space, as well as a little bit of law and space ethics and sustainment. That's going to aim to create a new workforce, but that's not all. We're also working on a series of micro-credentials. Some of those will enter the engineering degree eventually. And we're working on quite a few outreach programs. All of this is about building the future workforce for space in Australia. Then we're running a accelerator program. We call it a fast track fund, and actually we're dubbing it Launchpad. And the idea here is to accelerate low TRL projects into the ability to enter our core commercialization stream. So notionally, we want to take in research that's very early stage, so TRL 2, 3, and accelerate that to TRL 4 by creating, the first functional prototypes. And that will position them well to enter our core stream. So our core commercialization projects is where most of the grant money is spent. These are very industry-led. So industry comes to us with the problem and they say, we want to build a thing or we need a technology to be matured. And the universities are the ones to help. So across the portfolio, it looks like we're going to have 22 or 23 individual projects that we are maturing into products. So we would want to intake projects at a TRL of 4 or 5, and over the period, mature them to a TRL 7 at least, and ideally to TRL 8. So in the context of space, TRL 7 is a fully space qualified subcomponent. And then TRL 8 is flying and working in space. So unlike some other grant programs, we're extremely manufacturing focused. Everything that we're doing across all the core commercialization projects, I want to hold it in my hand. I want to be able to see it. It needs to be real. So it's not software purely. And clearly software is a fundamental component of every bit of high tech that we see in the future. But these are manufactured articles that ultimately are going to be launched into space. So it's a very upstream space segment focused commercialization program. And through that, we aim to give our industry partners the products that they need to sell in order to grow. And if they have products, they make revenue, then they have jobs. So like that's what it's all about.
What's the state of the commercial space industry in Australia? Because obviously it's very mature here, or I guess the most mature of almost any place on the planet here in the United States. What is it like there in Australia? How far along on that spectrum are you?
I'm going to tell a story that is a little bit sad, but cautiously optimistic at the end.
Okay.
So the previous generation of 10 years of low interest rates really freed up venture capital and allowed investment in speculative and expensive things like space. And space is very similar to med tech in that the valley of death is long and wide, and there's a lot of investment necessary to get these projects to turn into products and to get them flying. So it takes a lot of money. And prior to the recent interest rate rises and what's happened in the world, there's been a lot of investment. So Australia's space industry was relatively booming. And we saw the creation of a Australian space agency, as well as significant plans for funding. So we had multiple plans for national space programs of large value and significance. Unfortunately, the world has shifted. The rising interest rates basically mean that access to funds for space has been heavily reduced and made more challenging. So that means that these space startups, that is the largest part, I'd say, of our industry in Australia, they're going to face really tough times raising finance. The cancellation of several major government space programs has led to, basically sucking the wind out of the industry. So there's significant challenges, and we're left with a very, very fragile space ecosystem. But Australia is a very small country in population while being large in landmass. And we always have to think globally. We don't have the opportunity to sell to ourselves. And this is essentially a spur to push our country to sell internationally, because space, particularly upstream space hardware, is a totally international business. So there is expected growth. We are seeing our local space startups still continuing to raise venture capital. So that's very positive. We are going to continue to inevitably invest in space projects, and iLAuNCH is one of the notable space programs within Australia, although there are several other space programs. So I'm cautiously optimistic that Australia's future in space is going to continue despite the setbacks that we've recently had.
You talked about the government. How involved? I mean, obviously here we have NASA, and NASA depends on funding from the federal government, and yet there's a really booming commercial space sector now, and a lot of the launch has come away from NASA and has gone to private companies. Is your government involved in kind of the same way that our government is with NASA? And obviously there's a lot of government contracting that goes on to companies like SpaceX. Is there kind of the same dynamic in Australia?
Again, we're a very small country. We got 27 million people. I think we're smaller than a lot of your bigger states.
Yeah.
So the scale of government funding is commensurate with our population. So the funding from NASA to SpaceX is a very large number. Our Australian Space Agency does fund companies similar to the way NASA does, but the scale is completely different. And in the context of space, scale is the difference between a space rocket that can lift 16 tons in the case of the Falcon 9. And then we have locally Gilmore Space, which I worked at a couple years ago, and they're going to aim at a much smaller payload, so sub 500 kilos. And so you can kind of get the feeling that it's a different scale. Another thing that's very, very different about Australia as opposed to America is you have a much stronger federal government in terms of funding and the way the funding flows, whereas our individual state governments actually play a very large and significant role in funding. And I mean, that's notable. I brought up Gilmore because the almost number one new investor in their latest fund round is the Queensland Investment Commission, the QIC. So it's not exactly like all the money does or is expected to flow from the federal government. There's a lot of impact from the states and what they want to invest in.
Sorry, I kind of got off on a tangent there, but it's just interesting to me the way that the governments interact with space programs around the world. Let's come back to iLAuNCH a little bit and talk about the key members of the iLAuNCH team and what expertise they bring to the table.
iLAuNCH is actually a fairly lean team. There's only 3 of us in the executive. So Darren Lovett has a lot of history in military and civil space, working mostly on the government side. We brought him over as the director of SASIC, and that was in South Australia. And he's brought his connections and experience in government space programs to iLAuNCH, and it's very valuable. I'm got a history that's a lot more technically focused. So I've been in the development and flying of rockets, lots and lots of rockets. My career has been very hands-on, developing, flying, and sometimes blowing up rockets. So I bring a bit of a more hands-on technical background. And our chief operating officer, Melitza, similarly has been running space programs and projects across Australia. And she has a big history in basically keeping us all on financial tech and making sure that everything stands up to audit. We're supported by a smaller team of business developments and operational folks. But the idea here is, we are a bit constrained in funding in terms of our total number of grant. We're trying to expend it efficiently. I like to say I want the money to go where the magic is happening, not in operations. So that means we're trying to do our best to funnel the grant money directly to the research. And that way, that's where it gets the job done.
Sounds like you and Elon have a little bit in common about blowing up rockets.
How you learn.
Yeah, those rapid unscheduled disassemblies, I think is what he calls them. How does the collaboration between the universities and industry partners enhance your capabilities at iLAuNCH?
So in Australia, we have a acknowledged deficiency in translating research outcomes into industry. And this is something that is talked about with much gnashing of teeth. But the reality is, like, there's tech push and there's tech pull. And tech push can work when your tech is that good. On the other hand, industry knows what they need and they pay attention to the market opportunities because that's their job, right? It's their job to say there's money to be made, but frequently, like, industry is not armed with the tools necessary to develop that. So sometimes it's the human resource, it's the subject matter experts. And then sometimes it's the major facilities and equipment that is necessary to make some of these really advanced space and airspace topics happen. And that's where the universities come in. So the universities offer really experienced, really smart people who have spent, more or less their whole careers developing an expertise in, I'd say, kind of niche areas. But then simultaneously, if you walk around the halls of our three universities, you're going to see all this major equipment, and every little bit, bob, and box is like $1 million. Now, if industry is stressed to, fundraise however they need to buy that little box for one research project to get their product out to market, it's just not feasible. So programs like iLAuNCH essentially help them give access to the people and the facilities that our universities have, and help to commercialize the technologies in the universities and get them out to market fast.
You told me in an email as we were getting this interview set up that you had just received some additional funding and were scoping some new projects. Can you tell me about anything in the pipeline?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into too much details until the contracts are signed, because you know how that is.
Yes, I do.
So we've just sent out letters of thumbs up for $80 million worth of new space projects. So that's a substantial investment in all of our existing projects, and basically, so some of them we're planning phase twos, in some cases to get them to orbit, because our phase ones were planned to get them to TRL 7, so ready to fly but not quite there. So ideally we're going to fly a lot of these hardware projects as well as several new hardware projects, and stay tuned. We're going to be launching quite a few satellites in our program. And our phase two is going to augment that. To note, in our phase ones, we're going to launch our first satellite in the program next month. So that's pretty exciting.
I'm talking with Dr. Joni Sytsma, Chief Technology Officer of iLAuNCH on the Ex Terra Podcast. Take a moment right now to click on subscribe to be sure you don't miss any of our podcasts, or if you're watching on YouTube, any of the videos from Ex Terra, the Journal of Space Commerce. Joni, how will iLAuNCH's work impact Australia's space sector and economy?
So let's start with job supply and demand. A fundamental tenet of iLAuNCH is making new, highly trained workforce to meet the demand of industry. And industry all across Australia has been screaming, we need more trained workers. So in iLAuNCH, we're going to be training up at least 80 PhDs. So that's a large amount of segment of highly trained workforce that we're going to be churning out at the end of 3 years. And then it's hard to count the master's students, the techs, the postdocs. We're going to have something like 20 postdocs we'll be supporting, as well as new professors. So that's a large workforce that we're turning out. And then with the undergraduate, the space engineering undergraduate degree, to be determined what the numbers of enrollment are, but that's going to be a lasting edifice in our universities and allow us to turn undergraduate space engineering degrees out. Ultimately, what's that going to mean? We're going to have a lot of space-trained engineers and scientists out there in the field and available to work on space projects for Australian companies. So it's hopefully going to have a lasting impact on improving the country.
What's the level of enthusiasm, though, among the students that are coming into university? Do you see there's a lot of interest in space as a career, or is it something that you have to go out and really pitch?
Look, I think space is an easy sell. Everybody I talk to has stars in their eyes. They look at all the pictures of the Hubble, James Webb, and now Euclid. They're amazing. They look at the satellites that are all glittery and shiny, covered in gold foil, and as well as, of course, my favorite, the space rockets that enable them to get there. And space is hugely inspirational. So it's an excellent platform to draw people into the field. And you don't actually have to be only in STEM fields to be in space. Now, of course, I'm biased and focused on engineering with our space engineering degree, but we're going to enable all these space jobs for people who are interested. So fundamentally, it's not a hard sell. It's a really interesting field. When you fail, it's a bit spectacular, and you learn
Makes the
from it.
news.
Yeah, it makes the news. But on the other hand, when you succeed, there's a huge amount of value behind it. So all of these space products that we're developing, I joke that a ton of coal is $100.
Mhm.
A kilo of space stuff is $1 million. And I'm kind of not wrong. All these space subcomponents and satellites we put together are really high value, and they bring high value. And the thing about high value is that creates high value jobs. And that's exactly what we need in Australia.
What kind of challenges has iLaunch faced during its journey, and how have you overcome those?
So the last year has been hard. So iLaunch started January 2023. So it's only been around for a year, but like I said, it's a 4-year program. So
Mhm.
we've had to run fast. Now, with the setbacks in funding, and as well as the changing geopolitical situations, we almost lost half of our program
Mm.
from inception to start. And that's not entirely true. Maybe at the beginning of the year, we'd lost 30% of our participants. And by the middle of the year, we'd lost almost fully half. As a grant program, that put us in a little bit of dire straits. And our executive team went into, I'd call it disaster recovery mode. But I'm used to rockets blowing up and then learning from them and then trying to fix it on the next rocket. So we ran a outrageously successful expression of interest process for our phase 2 investments. And we managed to be heavily oversubscribed and bring that back. So we went from a severe dip in enrollments, as you might say, to fundamentally, as a grant program, we're fully back on track. And we're marching forth at speed to execute all those phase 2 contracts and fundamentally repair the program. So it hasn't been the easiest ride. On the other hand, I think blue skies are ahead of us.
So do you have any success stories that you can share over the course of the past year, some significant milestones that you've achieved?
For sure. So one of our projects is to install these electron beam melt 3D printers. And that is right on track. And they are going to start 3D printing high temperature metals like titanium and Inconel and nickel superalloys like next week. So that's pretty exciting. We have a new multi-material 3D printer. It's the first production multi-metal 3D printer in the world. And we're already printing little demos. And we've lined up industry partners who are saying, I want to use that. That's an amazing capability. I may have mentioned that we are launching the first of the satellites that is being supported by iLaunch. So the company Space Machines is going to be launching that in the middle of March on a SpaceX mission. We completed qualification successfully about 2 months ago. And it's been on a boat over to Vandenberg, and that bird is going up there very shortly. And I really hope the best of success for Space Machines. The list will go on, but those are the couple notable things that we have going right now.
You're going to fly over to Vandenberg and watch it launch?
Operational budgets have to be tight. So unfortunately, I'm going to miss out. On the other hand, in our program, we aim to launch quite a few satellites. So if I got to go on a trip for every satellite, I think we could launch less satellites. So I'd rather launch more.
You'd spend a lot of time on airplanes for sure. Joni, how important is diversity to the success of a multidisciplinary program like iLaunch?
So my perspective as a trans woman is that diversity makes the rockets fly faster. I've worked in all these engineering fields. They tend to be male dominated. And what I do see is if you get homogeneity in the workforce, then groupthink tends to become the norm. And out there ideas that would tend to push the technology further faster might actually be discouraged by the management. And I think what that causes is if you say solve the problem the same way it's always been solved, then you're not improving. On the other hand, you bring diversity into the workforce, and diversity of faces and colors and genders and all that actually leads directly to diversity of ideas. And then you solve the problems faster. And I've seen it over and over again. Diverse workforces solve problems faster. And all we really care about when we're trying to build rockets and spacecraft and stuff is how do we get it up there, with less problems and faster.
And not blow it up.
And not blow it up. So I definitely say diversity makes the rockets fly faster. I think it's really important to the field. And I think it's really important to the field to attract a diverse workforce so they don't self-select themselves out. If you walk into a workforce and you see everybody who doesn't look like you and nobody in the workforce looks like you, then you're going to say, I don't want to work there. That's a terrible place to work for me. And I think for people who are running the companies, they got to think, I just want the best workers and I shouldn't care what they look like. So it's incredibly important.
We're just about out of time, Joni, but we asked this question of all of our guests to kind of close out the program, and that's to look out over the next 10 to 15 years in space commerce and your role in it, and tell me what you see.
Look, I like to think I'm building the science fiction future, okay? And my science fiction future has space cities and space travel as an everyday thing. With SpaceX's new rockets, I think the lowering price is going to allow mass to orbit to fundamentally change. So allowing that is going to bring big opportunities for human habitation and exploration in space like we've not seen before. In addition to, we're already seeing it with Starlink, interconnectedness like we've never seen before. And we're at phase one of, data availability everywhere. And it's really important to Australia because a lot of places are remote, and having access to data from space is just phenomenal. And it's a real game changer for rural living people. So an acceleration of all of these things is going to lead to, I hope, good outcomes. On the other hand, I always think Star Wars when I'm thinking Star Trek. Putting a bunch of mass up there means that sustainability in space is the biggest new problem. So if it's cheap to put mass up, we put a bunch of mass up. The Kessler syndrome is never too far away. So we've got to guard against that, or else we might lock ourselves out of space for generations to come. And that's absolutely not what we want to do. So I think cautiously optimistic of what we can do, but we got to do it right. Otherwise, bad things can happen.
But do you see a fairly bright future for the space commerce industry in Australia? Because, as you said, you're a small country, or a large country with a small population. I hear Florida, we have like 17 million. So it kind of gives a little bit of a perspective. Do you see the space commerce industry in Australia booming at some point down the road?
Look, I do, because Australia is a nice place to live. It's a really stable government. It's a first world country. We have a top-notch educational sector, and all of these things typically lead to high-tech outcomes. And nothing is higher tech, literally, than space. So I see Australia as potentially being a world leader despite our size. And anyway, watch this space.
Watch this space. And that's a great way to close. And hopefully one of these days soon, we'll see an Australian astronaut on one of those Axiom flights. That'd be a lot of fun. Joni, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Pleasure to be here, Tom.
Dr. Joni Sytsma is the Chief Technology Officer of iLAuNCH, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Ex Terra Podcast. You can subscribe to the audio version of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and many other popular podcasting platforms. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our podcasts or any of our other videos. You can also get daily updates on space commerce by subscribing to the Journal of Space Commerce on Substack at www.xterrajsc.com. And one thing more, be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on X at XTerraJSC. Until next time, I'm Tom Patton. Thanks for joining us.
I wanna go faster, faster. Hands in the air, we're gonna crash. Searching for the answers like Galileo through his looking glass. Thirst for reason. Our dreamer's eyes we gaze into a sense of purpose known by few. Like finding water on the moon.